Hello, my name is Michael O'Keefe, aka The Movie Wizard. If you enjoy this interview and want to hear more top-notch film industry conversations, please press the thumbs up, subscribe to this channel, and hit the bell to stay in the know. Okay, hello, Paul Talbot. What are your overall thoughts on the Michael Winner and Charles Bronson collaboration, The Mechanic?
The Mechanic is one of my favorites of the Charles Bronson movies. And again, one of my favorites of the six movies that Bronson and Michael Winner made together. In The Mechanic, I always see the mechanic Charles Bronson plays a vicious hitman who's training a young apprentice. And the mechanic starts off with a very long sequence where there's no dialogue. All we see is Bronson's character setting up for a hit. So it's 15 minutes long. The opening of The Mechanic is 15 minutes, completely dialogue free. And I always tell people, sometimes people ask me, what's a Charles Bronson I should start with? I've never seen a Charles Bronson movie, and I say, start with The Mechanic. If those first 15 minutes don't turn you into a Bronson fan, nothing will.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It is a great scene. I got to rewatch it last week with my dad, and it's solid stuff.
Right.
So they had made Michael Winner and Charles Bronson, that is, they had made Chato's Land before, and
Right.
then Death Wish would come after The Mechanic. Do you think maybe The Mechanic is like a bridge from Chato's Land to Death Wish in a sense?
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting because Michael Winner and Charles Bronson first worked on Chato's Land, as you said, which is a Western in which Bronson plays a part Native American who's pursued by these racist white men. It's kind of like First Blood in a sense, where a man is unfairly pursued, and he turns the tables on them. He turns to be much more dangerous than they thought. So Chato's Land is a Western. When Michael Winner was trying to raise the money for that, some financiers told him, they said, well, if you get Charles Bronson to star in it, we'll make it. And Michael Winner didn't know Bronson at the time, but many years before, he dated Jill Ireland, who had become Charles Bronson's wife. So Michael Winner got back in touch with Jill Ireland and said, can I get this script to your husband and see if he wants to do it? And Bronson said yes. So that's how they made Chato's Land. And Bronson and Winner got along. And then when it came time to do The Mechanic, Bronson insisted that Michael Winner direct the film.
Okay, yeah, and I just find that in terms of that, kind of cool tough guy 70s movie, maybe The Mechanic is a bit more like gangster, that would lead into the vigilantism in Death Wish in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess in both films, of course, they're much different films, but of course, in The Mechanic, Bronson again plays a very stoic hitman who, very violent. And then, of course, in Death Wish, he becomes a very stoic, silent hitman. So there is definitely a connection between The Mechanic and Death Wish. And Michael Winner, before his collaboration with Bronson, he was mostly known for comedies. And then when he made The Mechanic, that was Michael Winner's first urban action film. And that, of course, became the genre that Michael Winner was best known for. So The Mechanic was not just, The Mechanic was like the stepping stone to Michael Winner becoming a master of urban action films.
Yeah, and to me, it really fits in with like Sam Peckinpah gangster movies at the time, like Bring Me at the Head of Alfredo Garcia or The Getaway. You can easily put The Mechanic on a double bill with one of those movies.
Yeah, absolutely. The Mechanic is definitely, I think it's a brilliant film. I think it's certainly one of the more underrated films of the 1970s. And as you said, it fits in perfectly with that early 70s mindset of the movies. It's a movie that could never be made again. It's so grim and so downbeat, especially the ending is a very surprising ending, a very downbeat ending. And as you know, they remade the film with Jason Statham. And the Statham version, I enjoyed. It was a good movie, but it did not have the ending of the original. And the overall tone of that remake was not like the original Mechanic. In the original Mechanic, Bronson is a very stoic hitman who takes on all these assignments, and he just goes and kills the people without thinking about it. He doesn't do any research as to why this person needs killing. So it's definitely a very very grim, very strong film, very deep psychological film also.
Oh yeah, definitely. I want to get to that. And I haven't seen the Statham one. I'm maybe because I enjoyed the Bronson one so much, I don't want to like not sully the original, but just have that comparison bouncing around my head. I can live without that. But yeah.
I agree. A lot of times I won't watch a remake also because I think it's gonna damage my memory.
Yeah. So there were two things I wanted to talk about in terms of the downbeat aesthetic of this movie, The Mechanic with Charles Bronson. And the first thing is the Herodias Bosch paintings. I thought that was fantastic, or the Prince or whatever. He's got Herodias Bosch artwork around his house, and it's all, there's very intense images of hell from like 500 years ago, interpreted 500 years ago. And I was wondering if you had to speculate, what do you think Charles Bronson as Arthur Bishop was seeing while he was examining that artwork?
Right, yeah. And the interesting thing, that was something, Michael Winner was very much into art. He collected art. And in many of his films, we'll see some classic artwork in the background somewhere that comments on the film. And interesting, Louis John Carlino was the name of the screenwriter of The Mechanic. And interesting, that painting is in the script. So that actually came, Michael Winner added to that, but that was in the script that he was looking at that. And as you said, yeah, the painting that he's looking at, it's a 15th century painting. As you said, it's called The Garden of Earthly Delights by the medieval Dutch painter, Bosch. And it's like, it's known as a surrealistic masterpiece, and it seems to depict heaven, earth, and hell. And among those images we see are nude young humans at an orgy, and there's also creatures that are half human and half animal. We see fish with human faces. We see a hungry, unhappy cheetah and a pig frolicking with humans. And we see a penetrating knife and intense fire and explosions. And throughout the film, the Charles Bronson character encounters those images. So that's something that's very deep. Yeah, that's something that's very deep in the film. That's something that encourages repeat viewings, because when you look at that painting and then throughout the film, we see those images being recreated. So that's something, an example of, like I said, Louis John Carlino wrote that into the script that he was looking at that painting. And then Michael Winner embellished upon that by recreating a lot of those images throughout the film.
Wow, that's fascinating. I didn't know any of that. And tell me, comment a little bit on that fatalistic philosophy of Arthur Bishop that is woven through some of the dialogue.
Right, it's very much, and like I said before, the character is very, very deep. We learn that his father was a hitman, which of course in the film they refer to under the code name of mechanic. Yeah. And he obviously had a very violent upbringing. For example, we see at one point, we learned that at one point his father, when the Bronson character was a child, the father pushed him into the water and forced him to learn to swim that way. And Bronson, like a lot of people from their abused childhood, they actually become the abusers themselves. Instead of rejecting the violence that they were subjected to, they embrace it, and they themselves become violent. And we see throughout the film, again, Bronson's character, Arthur Bishop, takes on that young apprentice, and he starts grooming him to again be a violent hitman. But he seems to learn throughout the film that that is not the right way to go. Of course, he learns it too late, but the film, again, does have a pretty deep character arc where he realizes that he should not be teaching this young man this lifestyle.
Right. Okay. So I also one thing that was going through my head watching this movie is that Arthur Bishop is like an evil James Bond. What do you think of that?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Very much the dark side of James Bond. That's a very good analogy because he's dressed impeccably throughout the film. He obviously is extremely precise in everything, not only meticulously setting up his hits, his assassinations, his murders, but also the way he looks. We even see his close of his hands at certain points, so we see how meticulous his fingernails are groomed. So he wears lots of different stylish, modern outfits throughout the film. Also, we hear him listening to a lot of classical music, so he's obviously a very cultured person. Again, as we said before, he's interested in art, and he's also interested. We see him go to like an aquarium at some point, so he's very interested in culture. So definitely, as you said, the dark side of James Bond is a good analogy or description. Also very important, he's also very meticulous, like Bond, very skilled with his weapons, very skilled with his methods of destruction, of course, James Bond usually only uses the weapons to protect himself, but the Arthur Bishop character uses those weapons to deliberately go out and kill people.
Oh, yeah. And plus, he does some traveling, goes to Italy. He flies the plane. He's got the motorcycle ride. Like to me, it hit a lot of beats like a James Bond movie.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's something, an important point, too. A master of vehicles. That's a good example there. Also, and then, of course, we see him scuba diving as well. So, again,
true.
So we see him doing everything.
Okay, so instead of John Barry, we get Jerry Fielding. And Fielding's made a lot of great film music. I played his music quite often on my radio show when I was playing soundtracks over the years. So I would love to get your comment on the score, and would love for you to point out some other Jerry Fielding scores that you might have enjoyed over the years.
Yep, Jerry Fielding, he started his career as a big band leader for radio shows. And he started off, he did some TV shows, themes for McHale's Navy and Hogan's Heroes. And he had worked with Michael Winter before on Lawman, Nightcomers, and Chatto's Land, and he worked with Winter again. And an interesting thing is, not only did Fielding write the musical score for the film, but he also created the sound effects for the beginning. As I said, the film starts off with 15 minutes of no dialogue, but that does not mean no sound, because while Bronson is setting up his first hit, he's in this really rundown building in Skid Row, and we hear radio music coming from a radio. We hear a ticking clock, and we hear radio talk show and other sounds too, even like gas being turned on. And Jerry Fielding spent about 5 weeks putting together the sounds for those first 15 minutes. So even though it's not music, it's still a heavily constructed soundtrack of sounds.
Yeah. And are there other Jerry Fielding scores you're a fan of in particular?
Yeah, he of course did a lot of work with Sam Peckinpah.
Yeah.
So a lot of those scores I like. And then, and like I said, he worked later with Michael Winter as well. Yeah, and The Gambler is another good, with James Caan, that's another good Jerry Fielding score. And
nice.
Yeah, and Demon Seed, that's a science fiction film, a really nice eerie score in that one. And then he also did the Bad News Bears. So that was, so again, just shows his variety there. And he worked, as I said before, a lot of work with Sam Peckinpah and Clint Eastwood. So one of the unsung composers of the 1970s, in my opinion.
He's like the tough guy sound man.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's a very good description there. Definitely, again, you work with Michael Winter, you work with Clint Eastwood, you work with Sam Peckinpah. That certainly gives you certainly plenty of tough guy scores right there.
Yeah. So I mentioned the Peckinpah crime movies working well in a double bill with The Mechanic. I'd also say some of those Lee Van Cleef spaghetti westerns definitely would too, because it's all about mentorship, like the old gun teaching his ways and making sure that that the evil ways get taught to the new generation, such as in movies like Day of Anger or Death Rides a Horse. What do you think of that comparison? Yeah,
absolutely. And in fact, something else that's interesting, the film that Michael Winter made right after The Mechanic, he was making a lot of these movies back to back. That also, Scorpio was about the relationship between a veteran government agent veteran government assassin played by Burt Lancaster and a younger killer played by Elaine Delon. And at the end of Scorpio, the apprentice turns against the mentor, which leads to the death of both the instructor and the student. So both movies back to back, if you watch The Mechanic and Scorpio back to back, that very much follows, they have the same themes. Very interesting to watch those movies back to back. Also very interesting to see that Michael Winner chose both of those films back to back.
Very cool. So if I were to do a Charles Bronson double bill now with The Mechanic, the one I would tag along would be Violent City. How about yourself?
Yeah, fantastic description. Like you said, Violent City had been made in 1970, and that was a European film. It was Italian and French investors. And even though Violent City, The Mechanic screenplay was written before Violent City, but it's obvious that when Michael made The Mechanic, that he saw Violent City and possibly studied it, because there's quite a few similarities. Of course, in both films, Bronson plays a stoic hitman who motionless hitman, and they both begin with silent sequences. It's a good bit of time before we hear anybody talk at all. And then both films have a long sequence in which Bronson's character is setting up for a hit, where he's putting a weapon together and meticulously planning to take somebody out.
Yeah, definitely. So is it safe to say that for you, Michael Winner and Charles Bronson are like the ultimate team in cinema?
I would say they were one of the teams. They certainly did a lot of good work together. They did Chateau's Land, The Mechanic, The Stone Killer, and the original Death Wish. Those four films I consider to be excellent films. I find them to be very underrated. Death Wish and The Mechanic especially, I think, are two brilliant masterpieces of the early 70s. I think they're both two of the more underrated films of the 1970s. In their later work, of course, after Death Wish, their next films were Death Wish 2 and Death Wish 3. So by that point, Death Wish 2, of course, again, I very disappointed to see them come together for that, since the original Death Wish was so good. Death Wish 2 is a disappointment. And Death Wish 3, which I love, which I think is definitely an action comic masterpiece, still I have mixed feelings, because coming after the original Death Wish, I wish they had collaborated more on something more serious.
Sure.
So after they did Death Wish, their work wasn't as strong. The work they did together, let me say that. So.
And you've done commentary tracks on how many Death Wish movies?
I've done commentary tracks on all 5 of the Death Wish movies. Yeah.
Oh my God.
I just finished the commentary track for Death Wish, the original Death Wish, which will be out in January from Kino Lorber.
Very exciting. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah. So I was glad to do that, because, of course, I did them all. When I do the commentary tracks, I don't decide what's coming on Blu-ray or what's on it. The labels will contact me and say, hey, we're doing this. You want to be involved? And, of course, it depends if I have the time to do it.
Yeah.
And so I had already done, over the couple of years, I've been doing the commentary tracks for like 7.5 years now. So over those years, I had done Death Wish 2, then I did Death Wish 4, then I did Death Wish 5, then I did Death Wish 3. So all out of order. And I figured I was never going to get to do the original Death Wish, but fortunately, Kino Lorber is putting that out on Blu-ray and 4K. So they offered me that. So I was glad to be able to have done all of them.
And maybe that was the best way to do it, because it must be incredibly rewarding having talked about movies like you say, very in terms of quality. But it's pretty. If you're a Bronson fan, undeniably you like Death Wish, right?
Absolutely right. That's right.
Yeah,
that's a good point. Right.
Paul, thanks again for your time. I really appreciate it. It was a lot of fun talking about The Mechanic with you today. What do you have planned for the future of your Charles Bronson commentary?
Yeah, so a couple of things are coming up. Let's see. Tomorrow, which is November 15th, Kino Lorber is putting out a Region A Blu-ray of the Valachi Papers, and I have a commentary on that. I originally did that one for the UK label Indicator, which was a Region B, and now Kino Lorber is putting that out in Region A. So that's the Valachi Papers. And then in January, I think it's January 25th, Death Wish comes out. And in addition to my commentary track, the Kino Lorber Death Wish is also going to have an interview with John Herzfeld, who played one of the subway muggers in Death Wish. And he went on to a successful directing career. And then, so his interview is really interesting, really, really fantastic. And then I also did a commentary for The White Buffalo, which will be out sometime in 2023. There's not a definite date on that, but it'll be sometime in 2023. And then some other stuff, something else might be coming up too, but I'm not supposed to talk about it yet. It's still, they're still doing some licensing and stuff like that. So, but lots of good Blu-rays coming out in 2023.
Lots of good Blu-rays. Any books?
I would like to do another one. I've got, some preliminary stuff, so we'll see what happens. It's, unfortunately, as from this era that I write about, a lot of the people have passed on.
Right.
I interviewed well over 3 dozen of Bronson's collaborators for my Bronson's Loose books. And of course, a lot of those people have passed on. So it's very important to get those stories. So a lot of the people that I write about from that era have passed on. So it's difficult to get, any new firsthand information, primary source information. So, but we'll see what happens. Like I said, I'm going to continue to research Bronson at however I can,
Yeah. So. Would you consider writing a book in a different style than what you used to? Because you've told me before, it's all about the details with you and talking to people who were, there and experience the films. But would you do a more speculative, almost like a fan theory style book where you're just kind of opining on Charles Bronson?
I don't know about that. I don't know if anyone would care enough about that to read that. Just me thinking about that. I don't know. I probably not. I don't know if anybody would, how many people would be interested in that.
Fair enough. Me and a few other people, but yeah, I couldn't give you any numbers. Well, Paul, thanks a lot for your time. I hope you have a great night. And
okay. Well, Michael, thanks for having me. Like I said, I never run out of things to say about Charles Bronson, so I appreciate you letting me run my mouth again.
Anytime, my friend.
All right.